It had been 3 months since we moved into the neighborhood, 3 months of trying to find our footing in a place where everyone seemed to watch, yet no one truly spoke. On paper, it was the perfect environment for my daughter, Emily, a quiet suburban community, manicured lawns, slow streets, and the kind of neighborhood where people boasted about safety as if it were an unshakable guarantee. But beneath the glossy surface, I began to notice something else. Eyes lingering too long, conversations that hushed when we approached, and most unsettling of all, the woman across the street, the one who would later change everything. Her name was Mrs. Thompson, but everyone called her Karen, and not in the joking sense. Her reputation stretched far beyond our cul-de-sac, whispered about in uneasy tones by neighbors who pretended to be friendly but feared being her next target. Karen was the president of the HOA, which meant she had power, not official legal power, but the kind that mattered more in a place like this. She controlled the tone of the community, dictated the rules people followed, and used the bylaws as a weapon. The smallest deviation from her vision of perfection was enough to trigger her wrath. And unfortunately, Emily, with her wheelchair, her slow movements, her tendency to stop and admire things in people's yards, was exactly the kind of person Karen deemed a disturbance. Emily was 12, born with a spinal condition that made walking impossible. She was bright, endlessly curious, and so determined to experience life despite her challenges that she often forgot some people didn't view her as an equal. I never wanted to tell her that not everyone would be kind, but Karen made it impossible to hide that truth for long. It started subtly, a note taped to our door reminding us of wheelchair track marks on the sidewalk chalk of some neighbor's child, a warning about blocking visibility when Emily's wheelchair was parked on the side of our driveway. I brushed them off at first, telling myself Karen simply misunderstood. But then the glances turned into glares, and the glares turned into something darker. She began following us with her eyes whenever we left the house. If Emily stopped to look at a flower, Karen would appear as if summoned, arms crossed, lips pressed into a razor-thin line. I told myself it was just an overzealous neighbor. After all, who would openly target a disabled child? That was the kind of cruelty that didn't exist outside of movies. Or so I thought. One afternoon, I let Emily roll down the sidewalk on her own while I worked on trimming our hedges. She loved feeling independent, and I could see her from where I stood. She moved slowly, stopping every few feet to peer at something interesting. That's when I noticed Karen step out from her yard, intercepting Emily near the corner. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw Karen's posture, aggressive, looming over her. Emily's shoulders tensed, her head lowered. I called out, and Karen stepped back, smiling as if she'd just been giving friendly advice. Emily said nothing when she returned, but that evening, she asked if she could avoid going near Karen's house. I should have listened more closely to the unease in her voice. Days later, the HOA sent us a formal letter citing Emily for unauthorized entry into a member's property. The letter described an incident where she supposedly rolled into Karen's garden, damaging delicate landscaping. Emily swore she hadn't gone beyond the sidewalk, and I believed her. Still, I paid the fine to avoid further tension. It was a mistake. Karen took it as proof we would bend. The targeting escalated. She complained about the noise of Emily's wheelchair wheels on the pavement. She accused her of intentionally staring into windows. It was absurd, but in a place where Karen's word carried weight, absurd didn't matter, perception did. The week before the stabbing, Karen hosted an HOA meeting in her front yard. I wasn't invited, or rather, I was intentionally excluded. I watched from my porch as she gestured toward our house, speaking animatedly to the gathered group. Heads nodded. A few eyes flicked toward me before darting away. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken but dangerous. Emily noticed too. She kept asking why Karen didn't like her, and I tried to reassure her it wasn't personal. But I could see the seed of fear beginning to grow in her, just as it was growing in me. The day it happened was deceptively beautiful, one of those clear, crisp afternoons where the sunlight filters perfectly through the trees, and everything looks harmless. Emily asked if she could take her sketchbook outside to draw the houses. She'd been working on a project for art class, determined to capture every detail of the neighborhood. I stayed inside, tidying up the kitchen, glancing out the window every so often to check on her. She was sitting near the curb, pencil in hand, head bent in concentration. I remember thinking how peaceful she looked, how maybe, just maybe, Karen's hostility wouldn't ruin everything. Then I saw movement, Karen crossing the street toward Emily. My stomach tightened. I opened the door, ready to call out, but before I could, Karen leaned down, her face inches from Emily's. The next moments unfolded so fast they almost didn't register. A sudden jolt of motion, Emily's body stiffening, Karen straightening up, her hand holding something that caught the sunlight for a split second before disappearing behind her back. And then Emily's scream, sharp, high, and shattering the still air. I ran, time distorted, each step feeling too slow as I closed the distance. Emily was slumped forward in her wheelchair, her small hands clutching her side, crimson already staining her shirt. Karen's face was twisted into something unrecognizable, but the instant she saw me, it shifted, softening into a mask of false concern. She stammered something about Emily falling and the knife being an accident, but I barely heard her. My hands were shaking as I tried to stop the bleeding, my vision narrowing to nothing but my daughter's pale face and the spreading red on her clothes. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the scream. I heard gasps, saw phones raised, but no one stepped forward to help. Karen's voice rose above the murmurs, insisting Emily had rolled backward into her while she was carving something for the community garden. She claimed Emily had fallen onto the knife, as though that explained anything, but I knew in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, that this wasn't an accident. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Karen backed away, her hands trembling, though whether from guilt or the fear of losing her grip on the neighborhood's perception of her, I couldn't tell. The EMTs rushed in, lifting Emily from her chair and loading her into the ambulance. I climbed in after her, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Karen, standing perfectly still, eyes locked on me, as if daring me to challenge her version of the truth. And in that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. The ambulance felt like a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and rapid medical chatter I couldn't fully process. All I could see was Emily, lying on the stretcher, her face drained of color, her small frame dwarfed by the chaos around her. The paramedic pressed gauze against the wound in her back, speaking quickly into a radio about possible internal damage and rapid transport. My mind was trying to piece together what happened, but every time I replayed it, the image of Karen's hand, glinting with steel in the sunlight, cut through my thoughts like the very blade that had pierced my daughter. When we reached the hospital, they wheeled Emily away so fast I couldn't keep up. A nurse told me to wait while they stabilized her, but the word stabilized made my chest tighten. I sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, my hands still trembling, my shirt faintly smeared with her blood. Minutes felt like hours, and the mechanical hum of the vending machines was the only thing breaking the silence. Then the sound of footsteps approached, heavy, purposeful. I looked up to see two police officers, their expressions unreadable, stepping into the waiting area. They asked if I was Emily's parent. When I nodded, one of them sat beside me while the other stood, arms folded. The sitting officer explained they'd been called to the scene and needed my statement. I told them exactly what I had seen. Karen crossing the street, leaning over Emily, the sudden movement, the knife, the scream. But the more I spoke, the more I noticed a subtle shift in their posture. They glanced at each other, and then one of them said Karen had already given a statement. According to her, she'd been whittling a piece of wood for a garden decoration when Emily suddenly reversed her wheelchair, bumping into her and causing the knife to slip into her back. The words hit me like a slap, not just the audacity of the lie, but the calculated precision of it. Karen had shaped her version of events to sound plausible enough for someone who didn't know her, someone who hadn't watched her simmer with hostility for months. I protested, explaining how Emily was facing forward, sketching, how there was no way she could have reversed into Karen without turning her chair, but the officers' neutral expressions didn't change. They said they'd look into it, that there were conflicting accounts, and that they'd need to review the facts. By the time Emily came out of surgery, the adrenaline had worn off, replaced by a heavy, aching exhaustion. The doctor told me the knife had missed her spinal cord by less than an inch. It had pierced muscle and caused significant blood loss, but she would survive. Relief and rage clashed in my chest. Relief that my daughter was alive. Rage that the person who had done this might walk away untouched. That night, I stayed by Emily's hospital bed, watching her sleep. She looked so small under the blanket, the soft beeping of the monitor, the only proof she was still here. My thoughts kept spiraling back to Karen. I knew her well enough now to understand she wasn't just lying to cover herself. She was building a case, twisting the narrative into something that made me and Emily the villains. I imagined her back in the neighborhood, already telling the story to anyone who would listen, making herself the victim, painting Emily as careless or even reckless. And I knew from the whispers I'd overheard before that many of the neighbors would believe her. The next morning, my fears were confirmed. My phone buzzed with a message from a neighbor, someone I barely knew, asking if Emily was okay after the accident. The word accident made my stomach churn. They wrote that they'd heard she'd been rolling too fast and had run into Karen while she was working. It was clear Karen's version was spreading like wildfire. Later that day, the police came back to the hospital for a follow-up. They asked if Emily was awake and able to answer questions. I told them she was still weak, and they said they'd return later. But I could see in their eyes Karen's calm, polished delivery had already made an impression. I realized that if I didn't act quickly, the truth would get buried under her charm and influence. I left the hospital that evening only long enough to grab some clothes from home, but even that short walk through the neighborhood felt different. People looked at me from their driveways and porches, their expressions carefully neutral, as if avoiding taking sides. I caught sight of Karen in her front yard, speaking to two neighbors. She noticed me instantly. Her smile was slow, deliberate, dripping with smugness. That was when I understood this wasn't just about the stabbing anymore. This was about control. She had drawn the battle lines, and in her mind, she was already winning. Inside my house, I stood in the kitchen staring out the window at the street. I knew I couldn't fight her the way I'd fight a stranger, not here, not where she was the self-appointed queen. I'd need proof, hard proof, something that couldn't be twisted by her words or warped by her connections. And somewhere deep down, I suspected she'd been so confident for so long that she might have left a crack in her armor. A neighbor with a security camera, a passing car's dashcam, anything that could show what really happened. Back at the hospital that night, I sat beside Emily and promised myself I would find it. I would not let this woman rewrite the truth about what she had done. Emily's breathing was slow and steady, but even in sleep, her hand rested protectively near the bandages on her back. I reached over and gently held it. My anger solidified into something sharper. Karen thought she could stab my daughter and call it an accident. She thought she could charm her way past the police, sway the neighborhood, and walk away untouchable. She was wrong. The next morning, I woke before the sun. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flash of the knife and Emily's terrified expression. The house felt unnervingly quiet, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I made coffee I didn't drink, my focus already fixed on the task ahead. Finding proof. Not suspicion. Not hearsay. Solid, undeniable evidence. I knew Karen's kind. She built her reputation on perception. If I didn't shatter that illusion in one decisive strike, she'd keep twisting the narrative until everyone forgot what she'd done. I started with the obvious, cameras. Many houses in the neighborhood had small security systems, doorbell cams, motion sensors, driveway feeds. I made a list of every house that could have had a line of sight to where the stabbing happened. Some belonged to people I barely knew, others to those I suspected already believed Karen's story. That didn't matter. I couldn't afford pride. I went door to door, explaining in calm, measured tones that I was hoping to piece together what happened. A few people nodded politely, but said their cameras hadn't been working. Others promised to check, but never called back. And then there were those who avoided my eyes, their voices clipped, their doors closing just a little too quickly. By midday, I had exactly one promising lead: an older man named Mr. Daniels who lived 2 houses down from Karen. He was reclusive, rarely attending HOA meetings, and he seemed genuinely unsettled when I mentioned the incident. After a pause, he admitted he had a camera mounted above his garage that faced the street. He hadn't looked at the footage yet, but he agreed to check it. My chest tightened with hope. If the angle was right, it might have captured everything. But that hope didn't last. An hour later, Mr. Daniels called, his voice hesitant. He said the footage from that day was missing. The camera had recorded up until the day before, then resumed the day after. The middle was gone. Corrupted, he said, though he didn't know how. His unease was palpable, and I could tell he suspected foul play, but didn't want to say it outright. I didn't press him. I didn't need to. The absence of footage spoke louder than any words. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just Karen protecting herself. This was coordinated. Someone, maybe multiple people in the HOA, had a vested interest in making sure no evidence surfaced. And Karen, being president, had the perfect excuse to check people's cameras under the guise of community safety. My mind went back to all those times I'd seen her strolling the street, clipboard in hand, visiting houses without notice. She could have easily deleted or taken any recordings that didn't fit her story. The thought of it made my skin crawl. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. It was a cover-up. That evening, I returned to the hospital to check on Emily. She was awake, but pale, her voice still weak when she asked if Karen was in trouble. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth, that Karen was walking around free, laughing with neighbors, weaving her lies deeper into the fabric of the community. Instead, I told her I was working on it, that I wouldn't stop until everyone knew what really happened. She gave me the faintest of smiles, but her eyes betrayed a shadow of fear I'd never seen before. That shadow ignited something in me. The next day, I shifted my focus to the HOA itself. If Karen was manipulating the neighborhood, the HOA meetings and records might hold clues. I knew they kept minutes from every gathering, documenting community concerns and any disputes. If Karen had been talking about Emily before the stabbing, there might be a trail, hints that she'd been building a case against us long before that day. The problem was, as a relatively new resident, I didn't have easy access to those records. But Karen had made a mistake in underestimating how many people resented her control. One of those people was Lisa, a former HOA board member who'd quit after clashing with Karen. She was cautious about getting involved, but she despised the way Karen ran the neighborhood. After some convincing, she agreed to meet me in private. Over coffee, in a diner miles away from our street, she slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of several recent HOA meeting minutes. My stomach twisted as I read them. There it was in black and white, a section labeled Ongoing Concerns Regarding Resident's Child. Page after page of Karen's complaints. Wheelchair damage to public pathways, potential safety hazard to pedestrians, disruptive loitering near properties. The language was sterile, but the intent was venomous. She had been documenting Emily as a problem for months, turning her into a liability on paper. I could practically hear Karen's voice as I read, dripping with false concern while planting seeds of distrust. But one entry stood out more than the rest, a note from 2 weeks before the stabbing. Incident involving verbal exchange between myself and child regarding property boundaries. Escalation possible if behavior persists. Escalation possible. Those words burned into my mind. She had foreshadowed this, and no one had stopped her. By the time I got home that evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. I noticed Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, talking to a couple from the far end of the block. She saw me, and for a split second, the mask slipped, a cold, flat stare that told me she knew I was digging. Then, just as quickly, the smile returned. That was when I realized something important. She was confident, yes, but also watching me. Closely. If she was watching, she was worried. And if she was worried, it meant she wasn't as untouchable as she wanted everyone to think. I closed my blinds that night and sat in the dim light of my kitchen, my mind racing. The proof I needed was out there. Maybe not in the form of a perfect video, but in the patterns, the paper trail, the small cracks in her carefully constructed story. I just had to widen those cracks until the whole thing collapsed. I didn't know yet that in trying to expose her, I'd be stepping into something far darker than a neighborhood feud, something that would put me and Emily in even greater danger. By the end of the week, the tension in the neighborhood had shifted. It was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It was thick in the air, visible in the way people avoided my gaze or crossed the street when I walked past. Karen had begun her counterattack. She didn't come at me directly, not at first. Instead, she worked the way she always had, through whispers, through paperwork, through the subtle rewriting of reality. It started with a notice from the HOA taped to my door, citing ongoing noncompliance with community conduct standards. The letter listed vague infractions, aggressive confrontation with members, failure to maintain safe oversight of minor child, and creation of a hostile environment. Each word was carefully chosen to imply I was the danger, not her. I knew exactly what this was. She was building a case against me, just as she had done with Emily before the stabbing. And she was doing it in a way that would make it nearly impossible to defend myself because she had the HOA board, most of whom were either her friends or too intimidated to oppose her, ready to back up her claims. The real blow came 2 days later. I received an invitation, though it read more like a summons, to attend a special HOA meeting to address recent incidents affecting community harmony. The meeting was set to be held in Karen's own front yard. I could already picture it. Me, standing alone, surrounded by neighbors who'd been fed a carefully crafted version of the truth. But Karen didn't just rely on letters and meetings. She was strategic enough to know she needed to make me look unstable. That was when the smaller, more insidious attacks began. Garbage cans tipped over and left in my driveway. HOA notices for minor violations I knew hadn't existed the day before. Once, I returned home from the hospital to find a large scratch running down the side of my car, deep, deliberate. And always, without fail, Karen was somewhere nearby when I discovered these things, watching. I spent most of my days at the hospital with Emily, but every trip back to the neighborhood felt like walking into enemy territory. I began to notice subtle shifts in behavior. Neighbors who used to wave now averted their eyes. People I'd barely spoken to seemed to suddenly have opinions about my parenting. It was working. Karen's narrative was taking root. The stabbing was becoming the accident. The accident was becoming my fault. And I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. When the night of the meeting came, I arrived early not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see who showed up. One by one, neighbors filled Karen's yard, folding chairs arranged in neat rows like some kind of suburban tribunal. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her expression warm and welcoming, the mask perfectly in place. When she finally began, she didn't mention the stabbing outright. Instead, she talked about recent unfortunate events, safety concerns, and the importance of community accountability. She wove her words so skillfully that, for someone who didn't know better, it would sound like she was the victim of a reckless neighbor whose child had caused her harm. Then she produced something new, a stack of statements from residents. Each one described incidents of Emily blocking driveways, damaging property, or creating unsafe situations. Reading between the lines, I could tell most of these were either exaggerated beyond recognition or outright fabricated. But the sheer volume of them created weight. In the court of public opinion, perception was evidence. I didn't speak during the meeting. I wanted to, but every instinct told me this was not the place to fight her. Karen was too skilled at controlling the stage. So I listened, I watched, and I noted every person who aligned themselves with her. The ones who nodded enthusiastically, the ones who whispered agreement, the ones who glanced at me with thinly veiled judgment. When it was over, I walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, my resolve hardening. I couldn't win this by playing defense. Karen wasn't going to stop, not until she had completely isolated me and made Emily a permanent pariah in the community. And if I wasn't careful, she'd succeed. That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen, I laid out everything I knew. The missing footage, the HOA minutes Lisa had given me the fake statements. There was a pattern. Karen wasn't just covering up what she'd done. She was systematically removing any opposition. I realized that if she could do this to me, she'd done it before, maybe many times. And that meant there could be more evidence buried in the history of the HOA, in the records of past disputes, in the stories of people who'd left the neighborhood under suspicious circumstances. The next morning, I started digging deeper. I called the county clerk's office to request public records on HOA disputes from the past decade. I searched online archives for old community newsletters, scanning for mentions of Karen's name. And slowly, a picture began to form. There were patterns, different people, different incidents, but always the same outcome. Karen's target ended up fined, ostracized, and eventually gone. But this time, she'd gone too far. She'd left a living victim, and that made her vulnerable in a way she'd never been before. Late one evening, just as I was piecing through another stack of old HOA documents, I heard something outside, a faint rustling near my front porch. When I opened the door, there was nothing. No person. Just an envelope on the welcome mat. No address, no name. Inside was a single piece of paper with 6 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: "Stop digging. For her sake, please." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a neighborly disagreement anymore. Someone, maybe Karen, maybe not, wanted me to know I was being watched, and the threat wasn't vague. It was directed at Emily. I stood there in the doorway. For a long time, the cool night air wrapping around me. The message had been clear. Back off, or the next accident might not be survivable. I closed the door, locked it, and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from fury. If they thought this was going to scare me into silence, they were wrong. All they'd done was confirm what I already knew. The truth was dangerous because it was close, and I was going to find it. The envelope's warning didn't leave my mind for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 6 words: "Stop digging. For her sake. Please." Whoever sent it hadn't signed their name, but the shaky handwriting told me enough. This wasn't Karen's confident, calculated style. This was someone afraid. Someone who knew something. And if they knew something, they might be the key I'd been searching for. I went back over the stabbing in my mind, piece by piece. The angle of the street, the way Karen had approached Emily, the placement of the sun. If anyone had been outside that afternoon, they would have seen it. I thought about the houses that lined the stretch of road where it happened, and one in particular stood out, a modest, single-story home directly across from where Emily had been sitting. I didn't know the owner well, but I remembered an older woman who tended to her flower beds every morning. She was quiet, almost invisible in the neighborhood's politics, the kind of person who seemed to avoid confrontation at all costs. The next morning, I walked to her house. Her name, I learned from the small plaque by the door, was Mrs. Avery. When she opened the door, I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes and the hesitation. I told her I just wanted to talk, that I believed she might have seen something the day Emily was hurt. At first, she shook her head quickly, saying she hadn't been outside. But as I turned to leave, she lowered her voice and told me to come back at night when no one could see. That night, under the cover of darkness, I returned. Mrs. Avery invited me into her small, dimly lit living room. She kept glancing at the windows, as if expecting someone to appear. Then she spoke in a hushed voice, and what she said made my chest tighten. She'd been standing at her window that afternoon, watering the plants inside when she saw Karen cross the street toward Emily. She hadn't been able to hear what was said, but she'd seen Karen pull something from her pocket, something metallic, and lean close. A A sudden movement followed, and Emily's scream pierced the quiet. Mrs. Avery saw Karen step back, hiding the object behind her back before I reached them. When I asked why she hadn't come forward, Mrs. Avery's eyes welled up. She said she'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had seen what happened to people who opposed Karen. She told me about a man who tried to sue the HOA over illegal fines. His car was vandalized repeatedly until he moved. A young couple who complained about HOA harassment had their fence accidentally torn down during a neighborhood project. She doesn't stop, Mrs. Avery whispered. Not until you're gone. Or worse. But fear wasn't the only thing keeping her silent. A week after the stabbing, Mrs. Avery found an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. No name, no return address, just a note that read, "You didn't see anything. Keep it that way." Inside was a photo of her front door taken at night. The threat had worked until now. Mrs. Avery's voice trembled as she admitted she couldn't sleep, that every time she saw Emily's face in her mind, she felt sick for not speaking up. She told me she would give a statement to the police, but only if I could guarantee her safety. I didn't know how to make that promise, but I told her I'd try. The next morning, I contacted the detective assigned to Emily's case. When I mentioned a potential eyewitness, his tone shifted from bored routine to cautious interest. But when I asked about protection for Mrs. Avery, he hesitated. "We don't usually assign resources unless there's an immediate threat," he said. Immediate threat. As if the veiled warnings, the missing camera footage, and the pattern of harassment weren't enough. I hung up feeling trapped. If Mrs. Avery spoke now, without protection, she'd be exposed. And I knew Karen, she'd retaliate fast, and she wouldn't leave evidence behind. I needed to find a way to shield her long enough to get her statement into official records. While I worked on that, the harassment escalated again. This time, it was targeted at Emily. One evening, I arrived at the hospital to find her upset. She'd received a card left on her food tray. No signature, just a childish drawing of a stick figure in a wheelchair with a red X over it. The hospital staff had no idea who delivered it, claiming it must have been a mix-up with a patient's visitor. But I knew better. That was the moment I realized Karen was sending a message. She could reach us anywhere. Determined not to be intimidated, I arranged for Mrs. Avery to come to my house at night so we could record her account on video. She arrived wearing a hood, her hands shaking, and sat at my kitchen table while I set up the camera. She recounted everything she'd seen, the approach, the stabbing motion, Karen's quick concealment of the weapon. Her words were deliberate, her voice steady despite her fear. When we finished, I stored 3 copies of the video, one on my computer, one on an external drive, and one uploaded to a private online folder. But Mrs. Avery's visit didn't go unnoticed. The next morning, I found another envelope on my porch. This one contained only a single photograph, my own front door, taken from the same angle as the picture Mrs. Avery had received. The message was unmistakable. They knew she'd been here. That night, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I understood the dangerous balance I was in. I had the witness. I had the testimony. But if I moved too soon, Karen would destroy both before the truth ever saw daylight. And if I waited too long, the fear she'd cultivated might swallow Mrs. Avery whole, silencing her forever. I looked toward the hospital bracelet still wrapped around my wrist from earlier in the day, a silent reminder of why I was doing this. Emily's life had already been shattered once. I wasn't going to let Karen take anything else from her. The next move would have to be bold, risky, and it would have to be done before Karen realized just how close I was to tearing her empire apart. The morning of the trial was unlike any other day the neighborhood had seen. The usually pristine, HOA-regulated streets were eerily quiet, as if the weight of what was about to happen hung heavily over every trimmed hedge and manicured lawn. The courthouse itself loomed like a fortress, its cold stone walls and towering columns a silent reminder that justice could be slow, but it would eventually arrive. Inside, The air was thick with anticipation, the shuffle of shoes on polished marble echoing under the high ceiling. Every seat in the courtroom was taken. Neighbors, reporters, even a few curious onlookers who had no connection to the case but were drawn by the sheer notoriety of what had unfolded. Karen sat at the defense table, her face pale but defiant, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed almost mocking in its attempt to project composure. Across the room, the victim's family sat close together, a united front despite the pain that had been carved into their lives. The prosecution opened with a devastating reconstruction of the events. Photographs of the blood-stained lawn, the medical reports detailing the depth and angle of the stab wound, and the testimony of first responders painted a picture so vivid and brutal that the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The words intent and malice were repeated like a mantra, each repetition striking harder than the last. They spoke of how Karen had a history of targeting the girl, how complaints about noise, alleged rule violations, and petty confrontations had escalated over months into a deep, simmering resentment. They argued that the stabbing was not a tragic accident as Karen claimed, but the violent climax of her hostility. Karen's defense clung to their narrative that the girl had tripped while holding a knife Karen was supposedly using to tend her roses. They portrayed Karen as a victim of a freak accident caught in the crossfire of an unfortunate moment. But their arguments faltered under the weight of forensic evidence. Experts explained how the angle of the wound made it impossible for the girl to have fallen on the knife in the way Karen described. The length and force of penetration told a different story, one of deliberate action, not chance. Even the location of the stabbing, far from any gardening area, undermined the defense. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was relentless. Every lunch break and recess saw reporters swarming the steps, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing, sound bites clipped and broadcast across every news outlet. Neighbors, once afraid to speak, began to share their own accounts of Karen's volatile temper, stories of shouting matches over inches of lawn, threats made over parking spaces, and an obsessive need to control every detail of the HOA community. The trial had become more than just about one act of violence. It was a reckoning for years of unchecked behavior. Inside the courtroom, the tension rose with each passing day. Witness after witness chipped away at Karen's credibility. A local teenager testified about seeing Karen holding the knife immediately after the scream that pierced the quiet afternoon. A paramedic described the terrified look in the girl's eyes as she whispered, "She hurt me," before slipping into shock. Karen's own testimony, when it finally came, was brittle and defensive. She stuck to her story, but her voice wavered under cross-examination, especially when confronted with inconsistencies in her earlier statements. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterclass in quiet devastation. They spoke not just of the physical wound inflicted, but of the emotional one that would never truly heal. They painted a portrait of a young girl whose innocence had been shattered in a place where she should have felt safe, a family whose lives had been torn apart, and a community forced to confront the ugliness that had been allowed to fester in their midst. They reminded the jury that justice was not about vengeance, but about accountability, and that no one, not even a self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood standards, was above the law. When the jury finally filed out to deliberate, the air in the room was electric, charged with unspoken prayers and barely restrained anger. Hours passed, though it felt like days, before the door opened again. The foreman stood, a folded piece of paper in his hand, his voice steady but firm as he read the verdict. Guilty of aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. A ripple went through the room, some gasps, some sighs of relief, and in the victim's family's row, silent tears of both grief and vindication. Karen's shoulders sagged, the mask of control slipping at last. The judge's sentencing date was set, and she was led away, her future now out of her hands. The weeks that followed brought a strange quiet to the neighborhood. The HOA, eager to distance itself from the scandal, dissolved its current board and restructured under new leadership. There was a renewed focus on compassion and community rather than control and punishment. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now greeted each other warmly, aware of how fragile peace could be when left untended. The girl's recovery was slow, but steady. Physically, the wound healed with the help of skilled surgeons and months of therapy. The scar, a thin but permanent reminder, ran along her back, but she learned to wear it not as a mark of weakness, but as a testament to her survival. Emotionally, the journey was harder. Nights were often restless, certain sounds still made her flinch, and the memory of that day lingered like a shadow. But she was surrounded by unwavering support, her family, friends, and even strangers who had followed her story and sent messages of encouragement. In time, she returned to the very places that had once felt unsafe, the garden where she used to play, the street where she had been attacked. Each step was an act of defiance, a reclamation of space that had been stolen from her. She would never forget what had happened, but she refused to let it define the rest of her life. And the neighborhood, once fractured by fear and suspicion, seemed to take its cues from her resilience. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the truth had been acknowledged. The narrative Karen had tried to spin, that it was all an accident, was dismantled not just in court, but in the hearts of those who knew the real story. The incident became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the veneer of suburban perfection could hide something far darker, and that vigilance was necessary not just for property values, but for the safety and dignity of the people who live there. And so, life moved forward. Slowly, painfully, but forward nonetheless. The girl, now stronger than ever, carried herself with a quiet confidence, her steps sure, her gaze steady. The community, humbled by what it had witnessed, learned the value of empathy over enforcement. And somewhere in the quiet moments, the family found peace, not because the past could be erased, but because they had faced it, endured it, and emerged together on the other side.